On screen, they were perfect. You had the bumbling, good-hearted country boy and the perpetually angry drill sergeant who, deep down, couldn't help but care for his most hopeless private. For 5 seasons on Gomer Pyle, U.S.M.C., Jim Nabors as Gomer and Frank Sutton as Sergeant Vince Carter created a comedy duo that became a cornerstone of 1960s TV. Their dynamic was electric, a perfectly balanced explosion of innocence and fury that rocketed the show to the top of the ratings and kept it there. America simply fell in love with them. The chemistry was so believable, so genuinely funny, that viewers just assumed the grudging affection on screen had to mirror a real-life friendship, but that's where the Hollywood story starts to get complicated. Behind the laughter and the perfectly timed punchlines, a different story was being whispered on the Desilu soundstages. For years, rumors have swirled that Frank Sutton, the man behind Sergeant Carter, didn't just find his co-star's act irritating, he deeply resented him. Some even claimed he utterly hated the man who played Gomer Pyle. The story sold to the world was one of 2 pros who made TV magic. The story whispered behind the scenes was one of quiet friction, professional jealousy, and a deep-seated frustration simmering just beneath the surface. For decades, the truth has been buried under layers of Hollywood myth and the polite smiles actors are paid to wear. But was this just a simple personality clash, or was it something more complex, more tragic, and far more human? What really happened between Jim Nabors and Frank Sutton? The answer reveals not just the truth about 2 of TV's most beloved stars, but a darker truth about the unforgiving nature of fame. To get to the heart of the tension between them, you first have to understand just how differently these 2 men came to Hollywood. For Jim Nabors, fame wasn't something he chased, it was something that just kind of found him. Born and raised in Sylacauga, Alabama, James Thurston Nabors was a quiet young man with a secret weapon, a magnificent, operatic baritone voice that seemed to come out of nowhere, completely at odds with his humble, country boy personality. He went to the University of Alabama, worked for a bit as a typist for the UN in New York, and eventually moved to LA, not to be a star, but to get some relief for his chronic asthma. He ended up taking a job as a film cutter at NBC. At night, though, Nabors started performing a cabaret act at the Horn, a popular nightclub in Santa Monica. His act was totally unique. He'd tell these folksy stories in his classic Southern drawl, and then, without any warning, he'd unleash that powerful singing voice, leaving audiences just stunned and delighted. It was a gimmick, but man, it worked. One night, a guy in the audience was particularly impressed. That guy was Andy Griffith. Griffith saw something raw and authentic in Nabors, something he knew would be perfect for his own hit show. He hired Nabors for a single episode of the Andy Griffith Show to play Gomer Pyle, a sweet but dim-witted gas station attendant. The character was just supposed to be a one-off joke. But the second he appeared on screen in 1962, uttering his soon-to-be famous catchphrase, "Golly," audiences were hooked. Gomer Pyle was an instant sensation. That one-shot role quickly turned into a recurring gig for 2 seasons. The character got so popular that what happened next was almost inevitable. In 1964, CBS gave Gomer Pyle his own spin-off. The idea was simple: Gomer enlists in the Marines. Gomer Pyle, U.S.M.C., was born, and Jim Nabors, the shy kid from Alabama who just wanted to sing, was suddenly the star of his own TV show. His success looked completely effortless. He hadn't struggled for years in acting classes or gone to countless auditions. He was just discovered in a nightclub, and his career took off based on a personality that was pretty close to the real him. Elizabeth McCrae, who played Gomer's girlfriend Luann Puvey, later said, "Jim Nabors was masterful as Gomer. Gomer stood for what's right with the world." That's what people loved about his character. He was kind, gentle, and everybody loved him. But this easy, almost accidental rise to fame was a stark, brutal contrast to the journey of the man cast as his on-screen enemy. And that contrast laid the foundation for years of tension. While Jim Nabors basically stumbled into fame, Frank Sutton clawed his way toward it with everything he had. Born in Clarksville, Tennessee, Sutton knew he wanted to be an actor from the time he was 9 years old. He once remembered, "The first time I walked out on a stage, I had a warm feeling. I knew then I wanted to be an actor." This wasn't some passing phase, it was his life's mission. He was a dedicated student of the craft, starring in his high school drama club before working as a radio announcer. When World War II broke out, Sutton's career took a detour. He tried to join the Marine Corps, the very branch he would later make famous on TV, but was rejected for being colorblind. He didn't let that stop him. He joined the U.S. Army and served as a sergeant in the South Pacific, participating in an incredible 14 assault landings. He came home a decorated war hero, with a Bronze Star and a Purple Heart. This was a man who understood discipline and the harsh realities of life. A world away from the innocent world of Mayberry. After the war, Sutton went right back to his passion. He didn't look for shortcuts, he put in the work. He enrolled at Columbia University, studied drama, and graduated with honors in 1952. His wife, Toby Igler, who he met there, said, "The first time I saw him he was reading a monologue from Hamlet. I never expected to be so impressed by a young actor." Hamlet. That was the world Frank Sutton wanted to be in. He was a serious, classically trained actor who earned his stripes on the New York stage and in the tough world of early live television. Through the 50s and early 60s, Sutton became a reliable character actor, popping up in acclaimed dramas like Naked City, The Fugitive, and The Twilight Zone. He even had a role in the Oscar-winning 1955 film Marty. He was a respected pro, a journeyman who had earned every single credit to his name through years of hard work. He was a scholar of his craft, keeping a personal library of over 3,000 books, all of which he'd read, because he believed it made his performances better. He once said, "Exercising my mind through in-depth exploration of various art forms strengthens me as a performer, gives me more to work with and makes my characterizations more interesting to the audience." This was the man who, in 1964, was cast as Gunnery Sergeant Vince Carter opposite Jim Nabors' Gomer Pyle. On one side, you had the accidental star, a singer whose folksy charm made him famous with almost no formal training. On the other, the decorated war veteran, the Columbia-educated actor who had dedicated his entire life to the art. Sutton had spent nearly 20 years building a career in gritty dramas, only to find his greatest fame playing the screaming straight man to a character whose catchphrase was, "Shazam." The potential for a clash wasn't just professional, it was philosophical. When Gomer Pyle, U.S.M.C., premiered in September 1964, nobody could have seen the cultural tidal wave that was coming. The pilot set the stage perfectly. Andy Griffith brings Gomer to the recruiting depot, and the gentle world of Mayberry crashes headfirst into the rigid world of the Marine Corps. And at the center of that crash was Sergeant Vince Carter. From their very first scene together, the chemistry between Nabors and Sutton was electric. Sutton, as Carter, was a tightly coiled spring of rage, his face a perfect canvas of disbelief. Nabors, as Pyle, was his polar opposite. A well-meaning force of nature whose innocence was as destructive as it was lovable. The conflict was simple but brilliant. Carter's by-the-book discipline was constantly being destroyed by Pyle's naive way of seeing the world. One fan later said that as a kid, he thought Sergeant Carter was mean, but as an adult, he totally understood why Carter wanted to choke him. The show was a massive, runaway hit. In an era of social upheaval and the growing conflict in Vietnam, Gomer Pyle offered a kinder, gentler version of military life. It was a world of harmless hijinks, not the horrors of war. The show's producer, Aaron Rubin, worked hard to keep that tone, saying his goal was always to find the humor in Gomer bouncing off the rigid rules of the Corps. And America couldn't get enough. The show never ranked lower than 10th in the ratings during its entire 5-year run. For 4 of those 5 seasons, it was a top 5 show, peaking at number 2 in its final year. By any measure, it was one of the most successful sitcoms in TV history. The Heart of that success was the dynamic between its two stars. Frank Sutton, who always saw himself as a dramatic actor, was now a comedy icon. He insisted that beneath all the screaming, Sergeant Carter was a gentle man. "I created the character," Sutton once said. "He's really very gentle. He has to be a lot like me." He brought a surprising depth to what could have been a one-dimensional role. You could see that Carter, despite all the vein-popping anger, genuinely cared for Private Pyle. The show made both men household names. Sutton was now Sergeant Carter, just as Nabors was Gomer Pyle. Their on-screen relationship was so beloved that it created this powerful public image of the perfect odd couple. The set was described as having a family atmosphere, and to the outside world, everything was perfect. But the very thing that made the show a hit, the intense focus on the simple-minded private and his hot-tempered sergeant, was starting to create a quiet, gnawing problem for the serious actor who felt he was becoming a cartoon. While America was laughing at Sergeant Carter's meltdowns, behind the scenes, Frank Sutton's frustration was apparently no joke. It wasn't born from personal hatred, but from a deep conflict in professional styles and the crushing weight of being typecast. Sutton, the meticulously trained actor from Columbia, approached his work with the discipline of a soldier. He was known for intense preparation and demanding perfection. Jim Nabors, on the other hand, was famously relaxed, relying on his natural charm and a more easygoing style. That difference was bound to create tension. Crew members later recalled icy moments between takes. Reports suggested that Sutton would get visibly annoyed during scenes he felt were too loose or when Nabors' casual attitude led to what he saw as wasted time. He was a professional who prided himself on hitting his marks, and the "ah shucks" energy that made Gomer Pyle so lovable could be grating for a man who saw acting as a serious art form. Just imagine the internal struggle for a man like Frank Sutton. He had studied Shakespeare, yet his biggest mark on pop culture was screaming "Pyle" into a camera. While Nabors' star kept rising, launching a successful singing career with gold records and variety show appearances, Sutton felt trapped. The world saw him as Sergeant Carter and nothing more. He was the backbone of the comedy, the wall that Gomer Pyle bounced off of. Yet, he was always in the shadow of the very character that made his own role so famous. This imbalance reportedly bred a quiet resentment. Sources from the production described their off-screen relationship as polite but distant. There were no buddy-buddy dinners after work. Sutton was a private man, and Nabors, despite his public persona, was also said to be more introverted off-camera than people realized. Ronnie Schell, who played Duke Slater on the show, hinted at this, saying Sutton never really adapted to the loose, vaudeville-style comedy they did later on the Jim Nabors Hour. Was it true hatred? No credible source has ever confirmed that. Instead, you see a more complex and human picture, one of professional jealousy and deep frustration on Sutton's part. He was a man who felt his real talent was being ignored, his ambitions blocked by the success of a character he likely saw as simplistic. One former crew member said anonymously, he was struggling, trying to drown out the frustration, the disappointment. Was that fair to Nabors? Probably not. Nabors was just being himself, the very thing that made him a star in the first place. But in Hollywood, perception is reality. And the perception was that Nabors' effortless fame was a constant reminder to Sutton of his own derailed ambitions. It was easier to call it a feud than to admit the sad, quiet truth. That a serious, dedicated actor felt like a prisoner of his own success. By 1969, Gomer Pyle, U.S.M.C., was at the absolute peak of its power. It was the second highest rated show in America, a ratings monster that could have easily gone on for years. CBS certainly wasn't going to cancel a cash cow like that. Which is why the announcement came as a total shock to everyone. Jim Nabors was walking away. At just under 40 years old, Nabors felt he'd taken the Gomer Pyle character as far as he could. He was tired of playing the bumbling private and wanted to show off his other talents, especially his powerful singing voice. He told the network he wanted to reach for another rung on the ladder, either up or down, and for him, that meant hosting his own variety show. Like his good friend Carol Burnett, there were other things, too. Nabors was reportedly getting uncomfortable playing a happy-go-lucky Marine while the evening news was filled with grim reports from Vietnam. Even though the show was always a fantasy version of the military, the gap between its cheerful fiction and the brutal reality was getting harder to ignore. Nabors later admitted he had a hard time watching the opening credits, since many of the real Marines he'd filmed with were later killed in action. While the decision was Nabors alone, it was devastating for Frank Sutton. Reports from the time suggest Sutton was stunned and deeply let down by the news. For 5 years, Gomer Pyle had been his life. It gave him financial security, fame, and a steady job that, for all his frustrations, was central to his identity. Now, through no fault of his own, the ride was over. The star of the show was moving on, and Sutton was left to figure out what was next. For a man who already felt overshadowed, this must have felt like the ultimate slight. Nabors, the man whose career had eclipsed his own, was now single-handedly ending the partnership that had defined both of their professional lives. You can just imagine the resentment simmering. Sutton was a loyal soldier, both in life and show, and now his CO was leaving the field, leaving him behind. This was probably the lowest point in their entire professional relationship. The onset friction was about work styles, but this was about careers and livelihoods. The public saw a star moving on to bigger and better things. What Sutton might have seen was a partner abandoning a winning team, leaving him to pick up the pieces. The whispers of a feud grew louder, now fueled by a very real, career-altering event. The beloved duo was officially over, and the quiet resentment was no longer just about art. It was about a future that had suddenly been thrown into chaos. After Gomer Pyle's run ended, Jim Nabors got his wish. CBS knew if they let him walk, he'd just take his massive audience to another network, so they gave him the Jim Nabors Hour in the fall of 1969. It was a classic variety show, with comedy sketches and musical numbers. And in a move that seemed designed to show the public that everything was fine, Nabors brought his former co-stars, Ronnie Schell and Frank Sutton, along as regulars. Sutton usually played Nabors' brother-in-law in sketches, a dynamic that echoed their old on-screen bickering. The show was an instant hit, finishing its first season at number 12 in the ratings. But behind the scenes, a new fight was brewing, one that would test the true nature of the relationship between Nabors and Sutton and reveal an absolutely stunning act of loyalty. Network executives at CBS were reportedly unhappy with Sutton's role on the show. They felt his persona was too harsh for the light-hearted variety format. More importantly, he wasn't a singer or a dancer. The pressure started to mount. Execs began to, quietly, and then not so quietly, push Nabors to fire Frank Sutton. This was the moment of truth. If the feud narrative were true, Nabors would have jumped at the chance to get rid of a co-star he supposedly hated. It would have been the easiest thing in the world: blame the network, say he was sorry, and move on. But Jim Nabors did the exact opposite, remembering the partnership that had made him a superstar, and maybe feeling responsible for ending the show that had been Sutton's life for 5 years. Nabors flatly refused. He would not fire his friend. He stood by Frank Sutton, digging in his heels against enormous pressure from the network. It was an incredible act of professional loyalty, one that flew in the face of every rumor about them hating each other, but that defiance came at a huge cost. The network's problem with Sutton was happening at the same time as a massive shift at CBS, what would later be called the rural purge. The network president had decided that CBS's audience was too old, too rural, and not what advertisers wanted. The order came down to cancel everything with a tree in it. In 1971, a whole slate of hit shows like the Beverly Hillbillies, Green Acres, and Mayberry R.F.D. were suddenly gone. The Jim Nabors Hour despite its strong ratings, was caught right in the crossfire. In the public's mind, Nabors was still Gomer Pyle, a symbol of the very rural America the network was now desperate to get rid of. His refusal to fire Sutton gave them the perfect excuse. In 1971, after just 2 seasons, the Jim Nabors Hour was cancelled. Nabors had stood by his co-star, and in the cold, unforgiving world of network television, it cost him his show. That single act speaks volumes, cutting through decades of gossip. There may have been friction, but when it really mattered, Jim Nabors proved he was fiercely loyal to Frank Sutton. The story of Jim Nabors' loyalty is one of those hidden gems of Hollywood history that shows you who someone really is. So many of these stories from that era get lost to time, but our mission here is to bring them back into the light. If you find these deep dives into classic TV as fascinating as we do, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you never miss what's next. And let us know in the comments, what do you think of Jim Nabors' decision? It's a testament to a friendship that was way more complex and genuine than the rumors ever gave it credit for. So, did Frank Sutton utterly hate Jim Nabors? The truth is so much more complicated than a simple yes or no. The story of a bitter, deep-seated feud seems to be a Hollywood myth, a dramatic tale spun from a small kernel of truth. There's just no real evidence that these two men truly hated each other. What the evidence does point to is a relationship built on professional friction and a whole lot of grudging respect. Frank Sutton was a serious, dedicated actor who found himself in the gilded cage of a hit sitcom, forever defined by a role he felt was beneath his training. His frustration wasn't really with Jim Nabors the man, but with what Nabors represented, an effortless fame that seemed to mock his own years of hard work. He was the ultimate pro who felt like a cartoon. Their work styles clashed. Their career paths were polar opposites. And Sutton was likely deeply hurt when Nabors chose to end their show at its absolute peak. All of this created a real tension that was easy for outsiders to mistake for a feud, but the ultimate truth of their relationship is defined by that final test. When the network demanded Nabors fire Sutton, he refused, sacrificing his own show to protect his former co-star. That one act says more than any rumor ever could. It reveals a bond of professional respect and, yes, a kind of friendship that was stronger than the pressures of the Hollywood machine. The story of Jim Nabors and Frank Sutton isn't really a story of hatred. It's a story about the brutal nature of typecasting, the weight of ambition, and the quiet complexities of a partnership that created TV magic. It's a human story of two completely different men, thrown together by fate, who navigated the treacherous waters of fame as best they could.